All right, Talking Church. I'm excited to be in Seattle right now with Pastor Russell Johnson. Thank you for making some time while we're out here.
Yeah, appreciate it, man. It's good to meet up again.
Yeah. And so I have so many things that we could talk about, but as many pastors and church leaders are listening, I mean, first of all, your boots, for those who are on video, is that ostrich?
It is. It's
Yeah.
ostrich.
Yeah. I was used to be a shoe salesman, so I can
Okay,
tell
you
right
know it,
away.
man. That's awesome. Let's go.
Yeah, so you're already representing well. But for those who maybe don't know you, don't know a lot about Pursuit, what's your kind of elevator? Like, when people say, hey, what do you do?
Yeah, 10 years ago this month, we planted Pursuit in a city north of here, about 45 minutes, called Snohomish. And it's still where I live today. It's a small farming community of about 10,000. And we planted the church in an abandoned barn on the side of the road, and sat on hay bales and had a Sunday night service. And that's how Pursuit started. I came out of a background actually of politics, worked in our state government, worked as a lobbyist for a season, did a lot of work on political campaigns, thought I would do that for really the rest of my life, and the Lord had other plans. And through a series of events, ended up planting a church. And today we have a campus in Snohomish, Kirkland, which we're at today, and then Seattle, right on Frat Row by the University of Washington. And yeah, man, God's been doing some cool things. There's something similar about the Northwest similar to where you're from. It's an area that is not really culturally inclined towards like church attendance or spiritually conservative values. And so, out here in the Northwest, a recent study just came out about a month ago, and they said it's the least churched, least religious area anywhere in the contiguous United States. And so it feels a little bit like being on the front lines, but God's been really good, and we've seen really some incredible things happen here over the last decade. And for us, like, we operate with the general elevator pitch vision statement of the church exists to glorify Jesus, and in doing so, bring people into an encounter with His presence. And so, that's our vision statement, which in one sense means a lot, and in another sense means nothing at all, because every dying church in America has one thing in common, which is a compelling vision statement.
Right.
And if vision statements could build a church, they would. So that is who we are. It is what we're about. It's what we design and build around, is that central statement of ecclesiology. But really, it's the culture, the team, the volunteers, the staff, the people who have really made this dream work over the last decade. And, really grateful to God being a lot kinder to us than we deserve. And I tell people a lot of times, they're like, wow, man, it's really blown up, and oh, it's awesome. And I think, for me, looking at what God's done in our church, I think more often than not, God's probably worked in spite of us, not because of us. And so I just try to keep my head low. We haven't had it all figured out. We haven't mastered the art or cracked the code on what it looks like to church plant in a major metroplex. I think we were available, we got lucky, and God helped us. And we just feel really fortunate to be in this position.
Yeah, I mean, I think all those factors are true, and I think ultimately God's going to build His church regardless of us, sometimes in spite of us.
Right.
When it comes to authenticity, I mean, coming from politics into the church is not quite the path most pastors have. Going from their Bible school to starting a church or working at a legacy church. But like you kind of breezed through it quickly. But what do you feel like has translated, and has it been difficult? Because I think sometimes pastors will make things political that we don't need to get involved in. But then I think at other times, pastors are afraid to talk about it. I'm sure both of those things have been positives and negatives that you've had to wrestle with. How has that framed your mind, or do you feel like you've had to detox yourself from out of the political realm, or was it more encouraging than you thought it was going to be?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question, actually. For me, I think coming out of politics into full-time ministry, it was, in a sense, almost like stepping into a cognitive disconnect between my old life and my new life, because I think in my mind, at least theoretically, I assumed that there would be no commonality between those two worlds. And I think the longer that I have walked on this journey of planting and pastoring and pioneering here in the region, the more that you recognize that God does nothing by accident, that God actually used a lot of the lessons I learned in the political space as as kind of like parallel giftings and talents in a different setting, but being used in now in the religious space. And when I worked in politics, what eventually got me out of the political world is that I was working on a U.S. Senate campaign here in the state, and our numbers were good. It was during 2010, during what they called the red wave, and I think we had raised like 22 million in 12 or 16 months. I mean, it was a highly watched, anticipated, funded race. We had a great candidate. And our polling looked good, metrics, data, and I was the field coordinator for King County, which is the largest county in the state. It represents like 3 million people out of the 6 million who live in Washington. And, we had a great team, dozens of employees, federal money was flowing in, PACs were helping fund things. I mean, it was a real life operation. And we got to election day, which would have been in November, and it was pretty clear about an hour after the results were coming in that the trend was not going to cut our way. And it's interesting when you like give your life to a campaign, and I mean, people think you work long hours in the church. Like, it's got nothing on politics. I mean, you eat, live, and breathe in your office for months at a time. And to get to election day and then just have it be over, and have it be over in the sense that you lost. And now all of a sudden, all of your well-laid plans are thrown out the window. My wife and I had planned to move to Washington, D.C. to work out of the Senate office there. And I was like, hey, this is my career. This is my calling. This is what I love to do. And after the loss there on election night, it was discombobulating. It was like, well, what's next? Where am I going to land? What am I going to do? What's the next step for our lives? And the Lord, began to work on our hearts in regards to ministry. And I had grown up in a Christian home. My parents were in ministry. My grandfather was a pastor, so I'm not new to the ministry world. And it's not like I was a prodigal. It's not like I was trying to run from that. It just, I wasn't trying to do like I didn't want to do it just because people in my family had done it. Like, I wanted to really sense what God had for me on my life, and then explore all of those options. And so it wasn't like this itching desire to be like, I have to be in ministry in order to be a fulfilled person, because either you're in ministry or you're not in the will of God. It was like, I was in politics. I felt like I was making a good impact, and I liked the work. I got a phone call from an Assemblies of God pastor in the area who also was politically involved. And he said, what do you want to do when you grow up? That's how he started the conversation. And I was like in my mid-20s at this time. And I was like, what do you mean, man? I am grown up. I'm working on campaigns. Yeah, we just lost. But like, I don't know. I'm going to go back to politics. And he was like, nah. He was like, I got a position at my church, stipend, part-time, Sundays only. Come be my young adult pastor. And at that time, it was just kind of like coming off of like a humiliating national loss of a Senate campaign. It was like, well, you can't get any lower than this. So I just throw whatever I can against the wall and see what sticks. And it was just like a part-time stipend gig, so I could keep doing my political hustle. And then on Sundays, I went to church anyways. I mean, we was raised in a Christian home. You always went to church. You was sick, you went to church. You was, on summer break, you went to church. It didn't matter. So I was like, well, I'm going to go to church anyways, so why not just get paid for it? And I'll go here and be like this little young adult pastor. And so my wife and I started attending this church, then maybe the young adult pastor. We walk into our first young adult meeting, and there was 3 kids there, 3. And I told my wife on the way home, I said, for the last about decade, I've worked in politics, and all I've done is be embarrassed. Because especially in a state like Washington, similar to Minnesota, the lane of politics that we work in is not a lot of positive results.
Right.
You don't win a lot. And I told her, I said, I'm tired of being embarrassed, and I'm not going to be embarrassed in ministry. So I said, let me call the pastor and just let him know he got the wrong guy. And she was like, don't be that dude. Don't be the guy who quits after one day. Like, it's no skin off your nose to just give it like 30 days. And if you still hate it after 30 days, then call the pastor and say, listen, we're just going to focus on some other things. And so I made that commitment to her, man, let me give it 30 days. And it was kind of like a reverse, like Advent calendar. Like instead of counting down to Christmas, you're like counting down to when you can quit, And it's not that like I didn't, believe that God could work with 2 or 3 young people. It was just like, I'm not signing up again for another uphill, impossible task. Like it's not what I want to do. And so we'd go next week, and maybe next week there was 5, and I'm like, all right, I got 2 more weeks. I'm counting it down, and we go in for like our final Sunday in this little young adult ministry at this Assemblies of God church, and we were meeting. I'll never forget it. We were meeting like in the back church cafe area, and I mean, there's a handful of us. It's nothing impressive. It's nothing major. We don't have a sound system. We don't got lights. We don't got cameras. We don't got a worship team. We got one young adult dude who brought his acoustic guitar who would kind of lead worship. And then like we would sit in a circle in chairs, and I would try to do my best to like teach and inspire, even though, to be honest, I didn't really want to be there myself. And I can't explain what happened, but on one of that final meeting days where I was like determining whether or not I was going to stick this out, during worship, the Spirit of God blew into the place, like supernaturally. I still can't explain it. The Spirit of God blew into the place. Young people are on their face, travailing, crying out to God, weeping. Power of God moves in. And I'm the most surprised guy in the room. I'm like, what just happened? What are we doing? What is this? What's going on? And long story short, we would have a revival at that Assemblies of God church for the next 3 years. And we saw thousands of young people coming from not just around the region, but around the state, people coming from Canada, Oregon, Idaho, Montana, because they heard that there was a well, there was living water that was flowing, and people got touched by God. And we saw hundreds of kids saved, baptized in water, baptized in the Holy Spirit. It was this incredible thing. So I'd go full time. I'd do that for 3 years. And then the pastor who was leading the church announced that he was going to retire. And I told him, I said, man, that's awesome. I love you. I came to work for you. I believe in you. And if you're going to retire, then I think I'll move on. And at that time, I didn't really know what I was going to do. I wasn't convinced I was going to plant, but I was like, I know I'm not going to stay here and be like the 40-year-old youth pastor, And so I said, man, well, if you're going to retire, maybe we'll synthesize our retirement dates. And when you leave, I'll leave. Clear the deck. Your new guy can hire whoever else he wants. And that conversation would lead me to, being let go from that church. And I would pretty soon find myself with a newborn at home, no income, no health insurance, no severance, and no plan. And, those moments will teach you really how to pray, get a hold of the will of God, the heart of God, figure out what you're going to do. And 8 weeks later, we would start Pursuit in a barn in Snohomish. And so, but a lot of the work that I did in politics, you start out kind of as a grunt, you just do whatever. Like a lot of what I did was like doorbelling. Like we would literally knock on doors on Saturday morning and like encourage people to vote for our candidate. And in Seattle, the only thing that they hate more than like Jehovah's Witnesses who go door to door are like conservative political operatives going door to door, like at 9 a.m., 10 a.m. on a Saturday morning going, hey, have you heard of my candidate? He's running for office. And I can't tell you like how many times I got cussed out, chased by dogs, threatened, that people were going to kill us. I mean, we were like the most hated, despised group of individuals in the world, but this was our job. And there was something about the tenacity of that and like the idea of you might knock on 500 doors in a day and every single one will say no, but there'll be one that says yes, that I think built like a resistance training in my heart because I would need that same grit and determination to start a church from nothing with no money, no sending organization, no like network who was going to write me a $50,000 check to get off, nothing. My wife and I would have to sell our house, move in with our in-laws. We bought a sound system for the church on a personal credit card. And I would go be bivocational for 3 years. I worked in pest control. I cleaned rats and raccoons out of crawl spaces in houses Monday through Friday and preach on Sunday at a church that I wish I could have told you, we opened the doors and it was revival from day one and it took off and the masses were coming, but it wasn't. It wasn't. It was like everything hit reset and we had to rebuild from nothing. and it's been the hardest work in my entire life. And there's been several moments where it's taken me to the brink of like, can I keep going? And I think the Lord used that political season to develop this like stubbornness inside of me that's like, we haven't come this far just to come this far. And we're going to keep grinding, and I'll knock on 500 more doors until one opens. So now I can see like the genius of God, like, oh, you were developing that in me in the political sphere because I would need that in the church space.
Well, it's something that I think so many people miss in the viral generation, to where there are people that can literally become famous in a moment
Right.
who haven't done anything to necessarily warrant them to get the attention they deserve. And because of that, I think everyone is looking for that shortcut, or they're, people graduating from, UW or U of M or wherever it is, and they think, oh, I'm going to get that six-figure job right away. And they've just kind of been lied to that that's what
Right.
it's about. And obviously there's this shift right now to where people are realizing, wait a minute, everything that I've been told is just go to school, get good grades, get a good degree, get a good job. And kind of as the economy shifts and as all these things happen, people are looking for, I think they're looking for people who actually have been punched a few times.
Right.
And that's why like the older generation and people that are willing to say the things that others maybe aren't, because they're thinking, man, I've been told that it's just going to be easy. And
Right.
if you just go with the flow and you just do what you're told and you just kind of stay with the status quo, in a lot of ways, I feel like your story encapsulates that. Like, no, kind of getting beat down in politics, getting beat down in church planning, those are the things that are able to sustain you in where you're at now, because like, oh, well, yeah, now you have a church with multiple campuses and now you're leading and speaking at conferences. And I just think the tale is as old as time, right?
Right.
Authenticity, consistency, and longevity over and over again.
Right.
And now when you look back at like those moments, I'm sure you look back with them with a lot of smiles and laughter, thinking, man, without those, where would I be?
Right. And I think for me, like that's the like I was speaking on this on Sunday a little bit, but like anointing doesn't bypass process, it binds you to it. And this idea of like when we look at the social media platforms, which I love, like I love the technological advancements that we have to make the gospel go viral, but like people don't post their low moments on social media. Like if you have kids, you're not posting like when your kid is throwing a fit on Instagram. It's like, oh, look, my kid's so cute and he just is all dressed up and looking cute. And it's like, well, they were a tyrant 5 minutes ago. They're going to have a diarrhea 5 minutes from now. But in this one split second moment, it looks like a picture perfect family. So that's what gets posted, which I get. That's what I do too. But I think if we're not careful, it actually like indoctrinates the epistemology of the next generation, that they think that life is filled with those moments, or that's how things start. And then in doing so, they get, depressed, or they get down if they're not an overnight success. And for me, this is why I love telling the story of how things started and the challenges, because I think honestly, people connect actually better with the authenticity of like struggle than they do with just the surface level like victory moments. Like, well, in this grand opening and, the church is this size and the budget's here and these properties and these victories. And it's like, most people are just trying to figure out how to pay their mortgage, stay married, figure out how to raise kids, figure out what chapter of Revelation the world is in today. Like that's like real life stuff. And for me, like, I think with the way that we talk about our story, I always want like the next Russell out there listening to go, if he can do it, anybody can do it. Like for me, that's the win. That somebody could look at me and go, if this dude who is maybe the least likely or the last to be chosen or a guy who did it backwards or a guy who made a lot of mistakes, if God can breathe on this, God can use anybody. And the reality is that so many people, like you had mentioned, they enter into the job market, whether it's, vocational work in like a secular space or whether it's religious work, they enter in with this expectation that it's going to be a dream job. If I find something I love, I'm never going to have to work another day in my life. And it's going to pop overnight because that's what we have been fed via the narratives of the digital age. And that is just not the reality. And not only is it not the reality, I think often that's actually the most harmful thing for somebody's development. Because when you walk through seasons of suffering and pain and disillusionment and insecurity, it's those types of moments that I think you really embrace the burden of the Lord. And in doing so, you count the cost of going like, okay, so the next time I face a giant, the next time I face the valley of the shadow of death, I'm not going to give up. Why? Because I've created history with God. And my history with God is not just at the elevation of the mountaintop. You know, God is faithful at every elevation of life. So whether I'm in the mountain or the valley, the faithfulness of God is the constant. I'm the one who's up and down. God is the constant. And I think oftentimes, you know, it's like that's what concerns me sometimes when dudes like miss out on this lesson, because then at the first sign of trouble, it's like they go into existential crisis. I can't do it, and God must not love me, and I must not be called or qualified or competent. And if I was really anointed or gifted, this thing would have popped right away. And I'm like, that's just not even the record of the biblical characters that we preach about. They go through years of obscurity, years of feeling like they were overlooked, years of feeling like they're not qualified, it's not going to work out the way that they want it to work out. And then in a moment, God moves in and things dramatically shift. And so, you know, I think for me, it's like, I think it says it in the King James when Paul writes his final letter to Timothy and he's encouraging him and he's talking about things like endurance and long suffering. I think in the King James, the way it's phrased is this. Paul writes to Timothy and he says, suffer well. And like, the message of suffering well isn't selling out any conferences anytime soon. And not that it needs to, but like if we don't have room in our theological box for things that don't make us feel good, we are not long-term in this business. And I just like, it's like, you know, like the axiom of the therapeutic age is don't suffer in silence. And I think there's some truth to that for sure, you know, but Paul's language is actually the opposite. Suffer well, shut up, die quietly, endure hardship like a good soldier. And for me, like those are the messages and the words and the lessons that I had to learn. Like I remember when God got a hold of my heart when I was working in the crawl spaces here. And like, I hate crawl spaces. I hate enclosed claustrophobic type spaces. I hate dealing with spiders and rats and mice and it's like the world's nastiest work, but it's recession proof because it don't matter how broke you are, you'll always gonna find money to pay somebody else to deal with your rats.
Yeah, we have rats outside in our house, so if you could just swing by after
I
this.
actually will. I charge a little bit more today for rat cleanup, but I'll do it. But it's like I remember like I was working down in these nasty crawl spaces doing work. And like we're wearing Tyvek suits and we'd have to duct tape our boots and our gloves and we'd have to get hosed off before we go back home. I mean, like micro dirty jobs times 100 is what we did. And like, I remember one time I was working alone in a crawl space. The Lord spoke to me and he said, Russell, until I'm enough for you, nothing else will be. And I was like, okay. And what does that mean? Like, it's true. I need you to be enough for me, else nothing else will be. I know that, but like, what does that look like practically for this moment? I felt like the Holy Spirit spoke to me and was like, if all you ever do is work in crawl spaces Monday through Friday and then preach the word to the faithful few on a Sunday morning in a little town that nobody can pronounce called Snohomish, but if this is what I've asked you to do, is it enough? And I had to really wrestle with the Lord and crucify my own ambition in order to be like, yeah, that's enough. And when that was enough, that's when God trusted me with exponential increase.
That's awesome. One of the advantages that you talked about with dealing with the political space and the rat space and all that is you get a thick skin. You realize that you can take punches, you can get beat up. One of the threats of that, though, I think, is when you're in ministry is you have this attitude of like, I can do it, I can fight against it. But then sometimes there are criticism points or wise people in your life that give you sound advice, or you need to be redirected. We all do as pastors, no matter how big the platform gets. You know, I started in young adult ministry, and the first time I preached as a pastor was to 700 young adults.
Yeah.
And so I'm the complete opposite.
What?
I'm like, how I literally held up my license to preach on stage and I said, I just got this 1 week ago.
Right,
And
right,
they
right,
told me that I'm here preaching now. Like, but that was where I was at. And I think that I realized there are lessons that I need to learn along the
right,
way that I don't have yet. And I got all these people that said, how can Logan have, credibility to do this? It's like, I don't, I really
right,
don't. I agree with you. And so how have you learned to distinguish the voice between, I mean, in this part of the country, there's no shortage of detractors. There's
right.
no shortage of people. But I think I worry at times that sometimes we almost look at all criticism and all roadblocks is like, well, that's the enemy in my way. And certainly most of them are, but there are a few. How do you distinguish between the ones that are? No, that's a God roadblock and that's a God word from somebody. I can't just be the one that says, no, it rolls off my back. I won't listen to anybody because I'm going after this.
Yeah, for me, it's like this balance of you've got to carry two realities in tension at the same time if you want to be an effective leader. And number one is you got to have a thick skin, but number two is you have to have a sensitive heart. And those two things, um, they oftentimes find themselves at least emotionally diametrically opposed to each other because you won't survive in any form of leadership, especially ministry leadership, without developing a thick skin. The church world is the craziest world I've ever been a part of, with the craziest expectations and the craziest people who say crazy stuff, sometimes 60 seconds before you have to get on stage and preach. And like, you know, I often like sympathize with the First Kings 18 narrative with Elijah, who like he has this massive victory on Mount Carmel, and like in the next chapter, he's in the cave and he's like, "I'm done. Take my life. Kill me now." And like the Lord shows up and he's like, "What are you doing? Like, what are you doing here?" And it's sometimes you experience those emotions on the same day, certainly on the same week. And for me, it's been this thing, especially as we reopened pretty early on during COVID, and the Attorney General came after us, and the health district, and politicians, and news, and it basically caused a church split for us when we opened early on, and at that point, I had burned the ships. There was no turning back. I had nothing to turn back to, and so we had only one option, which was put our head down and get through it, and we did, and the Lord helped us. But you know about 2-3 months before the COVID thing hit the world, the Lord spoke to me and he said, unless you crucify your need to be liked by people who don't share your values, you will not survive what's coming next. And I was like, okay, well, that doesn't sound very encouraging, but I'm sure I need that in my life. And then 3 months later, we'd find ourselves in a swirl where everybody has an opinion. And everybody feels like their opinion must be shared directly with you and you must follow their advice. And if you don't, then it's a personal, attack on their voice. And the Lord took me through a season where I really had to get serious about crucifying my need to be liked and affirmed by people who were either opposed to us or even well-intentioned people who just had maybe different opinions. And that was a tough balance because I think that there were some seasons where I was too thin-skinned and I would get too depressed about stuff. And then there would be other seasons where I'm like so thick-skinned, but that my heart isn't sensitive to hear, the feedback. Because the reality is that just about in every criticism, even if it's unfair, there is at least a kernel of truth that if you have an ear to hear, it can lead to development in your life. And so, like, one of my rules in life is that I don't accept constructive criticism from people who haven't built anything, because in order for it to be constructive, it would presuppose that you've constructed. And so, like, I'm not about trying to, take like a democratic poll on every decision we make. But even with like our board structure and really even our staff culture, I lead the church, and at the end of the day, I own the responsibility for the calls. But as the church has grown, so has the staff-led model for the church. We really lead as a team, and I don't just mean that in like a colloquial sense. We try really hard to entrust people with the authority to make decisions and help stamp this thing. And, you know, in any type of multi-site, multi-staff environment, as you are well aware of, everybody has an opinion on how to do it better than you or different than you. And that's been a real discipline of my life, of trying to go, look, I might be irritated and you might be totally wrong and you might have come at me in a totally wrong spirit, but there's something here of value that might be surrounded by a bunch of like BS that's just coming from like unhealed places in your life, but there's something of value here, and I don't want to throw out the baby with the bathwater. And so I think, those internal audits where you're like, hey, search me, Lord, find if there be any off way, wicked way in me, because I don't want to operate like with the Catholic idea of palpable infallibility. Like whatever comes to Russell's mind or whatever comes out of Russell's mouth is the sovereign word of the Lord. I've probably got it wrong more than I've got it right. But the Lord has been gracious to us. And so really just trying to lean in to people and hear their hearts and go, okay, well, that came across a little rude and kind of attacking me and you're all upset, but there's something there that I think I can learn from and that I can own. And even in this conflict, even if you're 99% wrong, I still got a 1% that I need to own that I can improve on. And so to me, I try to learn from the critics more than I learn from the compliments, because it's like probably like for you, like, bro, it honestly don't matter how bad you preach. Like you could get up next week and preach the world's worst sermon, and like your mom is going to come up to you and be like, dude, that was so good. I'm so proud of you, And like my mom's the same way. And it's like, and I understand that because the people who are for you are really for you. And that's awesome. You need those people. Those are, we call them roll dogs. Like those are your dudes who go march the gates of hell with you, come hell or high water. You need those in your life. They're really instrumental. But it's like, for me, where I learn the most is like from the folks who come up to me and they're like, hey, the application of that wasn't correct. Or like, that's wrong, or like you mispronounced that word, or that is not really a coherent hermeneutic for that text, and that sucks to hear, but I'm always like, yeah, there's probably some truth to that, so I try to like go, you can't live by the compliments else you'll die by the criticism. However, to be fair to the point you raised, there are people in your life who often will function as agitators, who carry a kernel of truth that if you have an ear to hear and can decipher through all of the other noise, if you can take it to heart, it actually help your development.
You come from a family of, you said ministry, it's been your dad, your grandpa, and I've seen this, that is a growing concern of mine. I don't really know how I've fully processed it other than how I've experienced it. But I've noticed as I've traveled a lot in the Muslim world, many Muslim background believers that come to faith, they don't fully go in because the cost it will cost them in their family.
Sure.
Because I've literally sat with people who say, if I come out as Christian, different kind of coming out than Seattle.
Right.
But if I come out as Christian to my Muslim friends, my father will lose his job. My mother will be ostracized just because I'm a Christian, not even because they're a Christian. Now, we in America don't live with that reality, and thank God for that. But what I am noticing is, as somebody on the receiving side of this, as a pastor's kid, when my dad, he goes out and he stands up for truth. He's gotten death threats recently, different things. He'll stand up for truth. There is a guilty by association far greater than we've seen in a while because of social media, all sorts of things, to where when he puts his neck on the line, he's like you, and that he's like, oh, I've been through terrible church experiences. I've been through all these difficulties. And so he's like, I'm not afraid, point the gun and shoot it and see if it goes off. And if God wants me dead, then I'll be dead.
Right.
But he's that way. But you start to see like, well, now it affects his family, and now it affects his staff, and now it affects the church. And there's a reality to, we believe that someday soon, that when people say, oh, I go to River Valley Church, they'll say, oh, well, you can't work here.
Right.
Or I go to Pursuit. Oh, well, you're not welcome at this campus.
Right.
How have you managed that tension to, when you go out and you speak against, Hamas, or you go out and you speak in support of this, against this ideology or for this ideology, to where not only is it you, but it's your kids, it's your wife, it's your staff, your family, And I'm sure there's a weight there where you're wondering, they haven't cut their teeth like I have, but also I have to be the general of the military that says, we're not backing down and we're
Right.
doing it. Like I'm sure there's a tension in that. Again, I've been on the receiving side of that, but I haven't been in the full leader seat to know the full weight of that.
Yeah, and I think that is a lesson that is so important for people to learn early on because, like driving a boat, my leadership creates a wake, and that wake allows a lot of people to be able to ride on it and some cool things to happen. But the reality is that those waves also continue to ripple out, and they'll hit docks and beaches and houses and people, and your leadership, your influence, your style, your methodology, that which you are willing to stand up for and be known for, it will cause people who never asked for it to have to pay a price for it. And so for me, if my leadership is going to cause people who never asked for it to pay a price for it, then I want the reward of my leadership to benefit those who never asked for it to be able to receive from it.
Such a
So
good
for me,
answer.
I'm like, I want it to be equitable on both sides. My wife is an immigrant from the nation of Serbia. Her family came over from Belgrade during the Balkan War in the year 2000. She grew up in a Christian family, but it wasn't a ministry family by any stretch of the imagination. They came over as immigrants. She didn't speak a lick of English. She enrolled in school here, learned the language, and many years later, we would meet in church and then eventually get married. And we had some of those conversations like before we got married, like, hey, what do you foresee yourself doing with your life? And at that time, it was politics. And so, like, I'm well aware that my decision to shift into a full-time ministry role, and not just that, but my decision to plant a church, lead a church, and then be willing to, speak out on any range of issues that might incur flack from, the culture or the community around us, that will have an impact on her that in some way she never signed up for. I mean, she did in one sense covenantally because we're married, but there wasn't like a cost worksheet when we got
Right.
married of like, this is what it's going to cost you. And it has. I think the word of God, the presence of God, revival pays a lot more than it costs, but it costs. And until you sit in the driver's seat in a primary place of leadership, it is hard to conceptualize or understand those types of costs. It has cost us time, energy, emotion, relationships, money, times of intense chaos and confusion, and just awkwardness. It's been like I think sometimes there's this myth, like if you step out and plant a church or lead a church, like there's a sacrifice that you make and then you move on from there. But the one of the axioms that you hear a lot in church leadership is that shepherds should smell like sheep, which I think is true. But I think what is even more true than that is that priests should smell like sacrifice. And so, like, one of the things that Maria and I have had to learn over the years is that the sacrifice, like, we can never get too far away from the altar of sacrifice. I think it's more important for me as a pastor to smell like sacrifice than it is for me to smell like sheep. I can't ever get too far removed from that place of like, this will cost us everything, and it's a well worth price to pay to follow God. And my wife and I have tremendously benefited from the relationships and feeling like we're walking in the center of God's will for our lives, and the friends who have become family and the people that we've rolled with over the last decade. And in the midst of it, there's been a lot of betrayal and backstabbing and late nights and tears and counseling and working through issues and insecurities and you name it. We've had to walk through it, and we'll continue to have to walk through it. Somebody asked me once, they said, when the church finally began to grow, and this was about 3 years in, when it finally kind of began to pick up steam, and we went from like 250 to 500. Somebody asked me, they're like, what does it feel like to pastor a church of 500? I said, it feels like pastoring a church of 250, except with double the problems. Like that, and that's the reality. I think sometimes the myth is it will grow to a certain level, and that's where it will get easier. And there are some things that get easier, but they are immediately met by other things that are now more difficult. And so it's a constant sacrifice that we have to continue to make. So for me, I'm like, okay, My kids are going to have to pay a price for dad's job. My wife is going to have to pay a price for dad's job. My staff are going to have to pay a price for what Russell speaks on and the type of church he leads. So if that is true, then I want them to also, as much as possible, be able to share in the reward of the labor so that I don't lose alone and I don't win alone.
Mhm.
We're going to lose as a team or take shots as a team, and we're going to win as a team. And so I try to do that through like just through the extension, like relationally of our lives. Like I'm not a guy who, like right now, our living situation in Snohomish, we have property and a house on there and some other structures, things like that. But on our property right now, we have 10 other people from the church who live with us, 10, plus my family of 5, so a total of 15. And my wife and I have always lived like that. We've always been like that. Because like, I'm trying to invite people into this thing. Like, I don't want to be Moses on the mountaintop who gets an edict from the Lord and then comes down and tells the people what it is and then goes back to the mountaintop for 40 days. I'm not saying Moses did it wrong, but it was just a different covenant. It's a different age. And so for me, I try to lead not from in front of the people, but from amongst the people and like invite them into the reward of like, we get to do this together. Isn't this cool? Let's celebrate this thing. I want you to feel as benefited from this as anybody else because I know that you've had to pay a price to be a part of it. And so for me, it's like, again, it's not a problem to solve. It's a tension to manage. And I think in senior leadership, that is the tension that we have to manage is that 100%. You want to address stuff in the negative world missiological context that we live in. You are going to take shots for just telling the truth. Telling the truth in a culture built on lies is a revolutionary act. Like you don't even have to be good. You just have to tell the truth and you will be a revolutionary. But that will come at a price that everyone will pay to stand in your sphere of influence. So I tell leaders, look, if they're going to pay the price, make sure that they get to share in the reward.
Yeah, it's such a good answer, and I think that as a leader, the more reward you get, I think in our minds, the easier it should become. But
Yeah.
if you look at the disciples, their reward was 3 years on earth with Jesus, and their price they paid was death. All of
Right.
them,
Right.
And I think that goes to like the high priest that got to go into the Holy of Holies. Like, yeah, they got to go in the presence of God, but they had the greatest cost. If they did it wrong, if they didn't purify themselves, like they have the
Right.
greatest cost. And so I
Right.
do think there is this trait that a lot of people are asking, like, well, I want that, but I don't want the cost. And I think it sounds like
Right.
cliche, but I think it's true. As we close this conversation, one of the things that is, you mentioned betrayal, backstabbing. I'm sure any church planter could go on and spend hours, talking about all those things that have happened. And it's sad that it's a reality, but I think if Jesus was betrayed by one of his disciples, then what should we expect in church planting in Washington or in Minnesota or wherever that is? What are some characteristics, if there's anything that jumps out to you, of people that have been there, and maybe they're haven't been here the whole time, but just people that have been solid, that you sent them out in a positive way, or they're still with you, or just people that you think back to and go, wow, I have amazing times and memories of them doing ministry together. There's not a heartbreak at the end of the story.
Right.
What are characteristics of people that maybe as people build their staff, they build their congregation, they build their friend group to say, these are the type of people that I've found maybe surprisingly have stuck with me through it,
Yeah.
or are because you have to have those people.
Right.
I mean, if you're always rotating in a revolving door, yeah, you might be famous, but ultimately you're not going to have any relationships through it. And then essentially it's just you, me, myself, and I, right?
Right.
Is there any like indicators or things that you've seen that people can look at to say, this might be somebody who's willing to go to battle with me and isn't going to turn around when it gets tough?
Yeah. No, it's a great question. And I think there are some real, I think, quality characteristics that come to the surface in those types of people. I think like
as you're hiring and as you're like thinking about that now, like you
Yeah.
want to go, where you're going.
Yeah, and you want to be able to go the distance with people. At the end of the day, like for my wife and I, our like personal mission statement is we want to do stuff that matters with people we like. I think more corporately, for me, how I express that is that I want to be loved most by people who know me best. And I think sometimes in ministry, when people get hurt, their value statement shifts in order to protect wounds they haven't been healed from. And so it's like, well, the last time that I was transparent, somebody used it against me. So I guess I'm not going to do that again. Or the last time I let somebody get close, they took advantage of me. So I guess I'm not going to do that again. And to me, like, to experience pain or to be hurt is what it means to be human. The only place that you will never be disappointed again is in the graveyard. And so, like, you want to be nothing, say nothing, do nothing. We got a lot of pastors who already do that. You want to endure hardship like a good soldier and press on. What the Lord will do is he'll add co-laborers to the harvest field who stand along with you, whose pain tolerance grows with yours. And so for me, it's like one of the things I like to say is, blessed are the flexible, for they will not break. And so for me, as this thing has continued to grow, it's kind of like when you bring a newborn home from the hospital and you put them in that newborn outfit and they look so cute. And you're like, oh man, I wish you'd just stay this size forever. And you're saying that, but it's not really true. Because of course, if they were to stay that size or that developmental stage forever, that would be a serious medical crisis. But I think sometimes in life, what you find is like people in your sphere of influence or who are around you who think that way about church. And really, it's because they are intoxicated on the fumes of nostalgia. What was? Ah, man, I just wish it would look like what it did back then. Oh man, just remember the barn days where it was so simple. And I was like, simple for who? Because I was working in pest control 12 hours a day to put food on the table. Simple for you because you just got to show up. But like, I'm thankful we're at the size we are now because it's afforded us more room to be able to do more things. But for me, when I'm looking at, and I was actually just having this conversation with my wife last week, and I was talking about like, hey, at the age of life we're at and the stage of life we're at, I was like, I'm trying to like develop relationships with people I'm going to run with for life. Because it's exhausting trying to rebuild your entire friend network every 24 months. And what I mean by that is like, I'm looking for people who have the flexibility to grow, change, develop in season and out of season. And in order to do that, your pain tolerance must continue to grow because growth necessitates change, change necessitates pain. So you do not grow without there being pain. And so it's like, for me, one of the things that's been cool is that there are still today a lot of our staff members who were kids in our youth and young adult ministry 13 years ago. And while I was working at that church, I was also a Bible teacher at their Christian high school. We got people on staff with us today who are helping lead this entire multi-site, multi-million, multi-thousand member congregation who were 15 when I was their high school teacher. And they're still with us today. And we've had so many evolutions of growth, so many changes, so many seasons of like, well, we did this way then, but it's not working now. And we've got to reframe and rethink and redraw the org map and think differently because we're at a different size. And we've got to figure out how we're going to operate now in this new season. Now we're multi-site. And how does that look? And the enduring quality of people who have stuck with us over the years has been people who have the flexibility to view themselves from an objective perspective that says, I'm not going to get stuck in one developmental stage of my life because it's comfortable or easy, or I've been able to define what those parameters look like and it's safe. So I'm going to stay here. But people who are like consumed with the spirit of adventure, this idea, like there's always going to be something more. There's always going to be a new area for me to grow. And there's always going to be a new challenge, a new mountain for us to take, more territory to expand. And I never want my memories to become more powerful than my dreams. And so like for me, when I take like an audit of the people who are closest to me now, the relationships that have stood the test of time, they're people who are not threatened by change. They're not insecure when things shift into new seasons and we have to rethink how we're operating. They're people who view those challenges with a sense of optimism, like, no, we can do anything. And, for me, even when I'm hiring staff, I'm looking at that going like, yo, man, I might be hiring you today for one job. And in a month, we got another campus that opens or another opportunity and I need you to shift. And like, are you going to have a midlife crisis about that? Because if so, if you're looking for super stable, never changing, hermetically sealed, and like no challenge, again, there's a lot of churches that you could work at that can guarantee you that. But I use this analogy because I fly a lot. I know you do too, going around the nation, around the world, speaking, sharing. adventures, vacations, things of that nature. You always get on the plane, and what does the stewardess say? On the intercom before you take off. Here on American Airlines, our highest priority is your safety. And I tell staff when I hire them, my highest priority is not your safety, it's your development. And you've got to figure out what your highest priority is. Because if you're coming into this organization and your highest priority is safety or stability, all you will do is frustrate me, and all I'll do is frustrate you, and I'm not changing. This is who God has made me to be. We're going to charge the hill. We're going to do daring things. We're going to bet the house. And we're going to see what God does. And so that's how, like, as I've clarified more about who I am constitutionally, it's actually helped us in the hiring process, because, like, I don't want to do a disservice to people by setting them up in a position that they're only going to fail at because they don't value-wise sync up with the type of leader that I am. And so it's funny because that's like the type of people that you hire who do the best work for you are the same type of people that you relate with, who become your best type of friends. And really, my greatest friends are the people that I employ today. They're people who roll with us, and so I think there's a symbiotic relationship between the familial system that you develop and the organizational system that you lead. Those two things run in tangent. They're parallel. They're in separate lanes, but they're on the same freeway, operating generally at the same speed. And so what I found is that the same thing I value in employees, I value in friends. Like, hey, as soon as we hit a speed bump, are you out of here? Or are you like, no, I got the flexibility to grow with you, develop with you, grind with you, work with you, cry with you, weep with you, rejoice with you? Because when I look at that, I'm like, okay, man, you a long-termer.
Yeah, I love that. You better be flexible because we're gonna bend, but you're not gonna break. And
Right.
I love that. I think that was, we see that in our lead team. People who've been in multiple different jobs, done all sorts of different things, but they've stuck through it.
Yeah.
And we could talk for hours on this, but I think there's a lot of people drawn to you because you have this creative, artistic, Pentecostal, but in a very like liberal place with a passion side of you and all this. And so I think you've brought a lot of wisdom for us today. And again, we'll have to do this another time to expand further on all those thoughts. But thank you for making time for Talking Church while we were in town and hosting us here at your spot. And until next time, Russell Johnson, thank you so much.
Appreciate you, boss.